Stephen A. Smith just did the one thing the WNBA did not want anyone to do. He took the Sophie Cunningham controversy and made it national. Not WNBA national, real national. The kind of national where people who do not watch a single Fever game suddenly have an opinion. The kind of national where one player's comments stop being just sports and start turning into a full-blown cultural fight. And that is exactly what happened here, because once Stephen A. stepped in, this stopped being just about Sophie Cunningham. It stopped being just about Brittney Griner. It stopped being just about Caitlin Clark. Now, it is about the WNBA itself. What kind of league it wants to be, what kind of voices it can tolerate, and why Caitlin Clark somehow keeps ending up in the center of every major storm even when she is not the one starting it. That is the part people cannot ignore anymore, because this was supposed to be one player speaking her mind. Instead, it exposed a much bigger problem. A league growing faster than it knows how to emotionally, politically, or culturally manage. And once you see that, everything else starts making more sense. So, let's break down what Sophie Cunningham said, why Stephen A. Smith's reaction changed the scale of the story, why Brittney Griner's name keeps getting pulled into the middle of it, and why Caitlin Clark keeps becoming the face of debate she did not create. Because this is not really one controversy. It is three controversies crashing into each other at the same time, and the WNBA looks less prepared for that every single week. Sophie Cunningham said it clearly and did not take it back. This all starts with Sophie Cunningham doing something athletes almost never do anymore. She answered directly. No soft PR language, no dancing around the question. No, I'd rather not get into that. She was asked about protecting girls and women's sports. And she said what she believed. She said it was common sense. She said protecting girls matters. She referenced fairness. She referenced Title IX. And she made it clear that she was not going to abandon that position because the reaction got loud. That alone was enough to make headlines. But then came the part that made it even harder for people to spin. She also said she does not hate anyone. She said there is room for everyone, but she still stood firm on her belief that biological women's rights in women's sports need to be protected. That combination hit like a hammer, because now critics could not just dismiss it as a sloppy outburst and supporters could not just call it misunderstood. It was intentional. It was calm and it was extremely clear. That is why it spread so fast, not because Sophie was loud, because she was precise. And in today's sports world, clarity is way more dangerous than chaos. Chaos gets dismissed. Clarity forces people to pick a side. That is exactly what happened here. Then Stephen A. made it impossible to contain. This is where the whole thing exploded, because Sophie Cunningham saying something controversial is one thing. Stephen A. Smith deciding that the debate matters enough to elevate. That is something else entirely. That is when a league controversy becomes a national sports controversy. And once that happened, the WNBA lost control of the room, because Stephen A. does not frame these stories like an insider trying to preserve league feelings. He frames them like a mainstream sports voice talking to millions of people who want one simple answer. Is this fair or not? That is the danger. The WNBA likes nuance. Stephen A. likes pressure. The WNBA likes internal framing. Stephen A. throws it into open air. So, the second he attached his voice to this larger fairness conversation, the story changed shape. Now it is not, what did Sophie mean? Now it becomes, why is this league always in the middle of these same uncomfortable fights? And even worse for the league, why does Caitlin Clark keep ending up right in the middle of all of them? That is the question Stephen A. makes unavoidable. Because now this is not just about one athlete's beliefs. Now this is about optics, power, league identity, audience trust, and the sense that every big WNBA controversy now somehow bends back toward the same few names. That is not normal. And when something keeps happening around the same players, the public stops treating it like coincidence. Why Brittney Griner gets pulled into this so fast? This is the most combustible part of the entire discussion. Because once people start talking about fairness in women's sports at a national level, Brittney Griner's name immediately gets dragged into the conversation. That does not mean every claim people throw around online is valid, far from it. In fact, a lot of the online conversation gets reckless very quickly. That is exactly why the strongest version of the story is not built on rumor, it is built on symbolism. Griner has become one of the athletes people use as a symbolic figure in a much larger public debate. And once that happens, basketball alone is no longer what people are reacting to. They are reacting to what they think Griner represents. That is why her name keeps surfacing so fast in debates like this. Not because the public suddenly became obsessed with one specific game or one specific quote, but because she now sits at the intersection of sports, politics, gender, visibility, and ideology. That makes her one of the most symbolically loaded athletes in the sport. And once Sophie Cunningham's comments broke into mainstream attention, a lot of fans immediately started reading the story through Griner. Again, not always fairly, not always carefully, but immediately. That is the modern sports media machine, and once Stephen A. enters that machine, it accelerates even faster. But here is the part that says the most about the WNBA. Even in a story where Sophie Cunningham did the talking and Stephen A. Smith made the noise bigger, Caitlin Clark still ends up in the middle. That is the part people should really be paying attention to. Because Clark did not say this. Clark did not start this debate. Clark is not the one turning post-game interviews into national culture war material. And yet her name keeps getting dragged back into the center. Why? Because she is now the WNBA's pressure point. Everything bends toward her because she is the league's biggest magnet for attention. If Sophie speaks, fans connected to Clark because Sophie is one of the players most publicly associated with protecting and backing her. If Griner's name comes up, fans connected to Clark because every physical or symbolic controversy around the league now gets refracted through how Clark is treated. If Stephen A. takes the debate national, Clark still ends up part of the story because she represents the broader transformation of the WNBA into a much bigger and much messier product. That is the reality now. Clark is no longer just the biggest young star in the league. She is the league's emotional center of gravity. That means even stories she does not start keep orbiting back toward her. That is a huge burden, and it is one the WNBA still does not seem fully equipped to handle. This is not really about one quote. It is about a league in transition. The biggest mistake people make is treating this like a single controversy. It is not. This is a stress fracture showing up in public. The WNBA is trying to be several things at once. It wants explosive mainstream growth. It wants bigger sponsorships. It wants mass relevance. It wants broader audiences. It wants to keep its cultural identity. It wants to remain values-driven. It wants to protect its internal sense of self. It wants all of that at the same time. That is a difficult balance, and the harder Clark pushes the growth side of the equation, the more unstable that balance becomes because growth changes the audience. The audience gets bigger. It gets broader. It gets noisier. It gets less ideologically uniform. It gets more emotional, and it gets much harder to manage with the old internal rules. That is where the real tension is. Not Sophie versus Brittney. Not Stephen A. versus the WNBA. The real tension is between the old WNBA ecosystem and the new one. Clark accelerated that transition. Sophie exposed how sensitive the culture around it has become. Stephen A. exposed how vulnerable the league looks once the debate leaves its own walls. That is why this moment matters. It is not just hot because it is controversial. It is hot because it reveals weakness. Why Stephen A's framing is so dangerous for the league. What makes Stephen A so difficult for the WNBA in moments like this is that he simplifies the fight in a way the league does not want. He does not live in careful internal terminology. He lives in blunt sports media terms. Fair or unfair. Strong or weak. Common sense or nonsense, clarity or confusion. And when the WNBA is already struggling to explain itself clearly, that is a problem. Because mainstream audiences are not patient with complicated internal framing. They want to know who said what, why does it matter, who looks honest, who looks weak, who looks like they are dodging reality. That is the arena Stephen A forces this conversation into. And once that happens, the WNBA's preferred tone starts losing power. Now the story is moving at a different speed. Now the audience is much bigger. Now the league is no longer talking mostly to insiders. Now it is talking to everybody. That is dangerous if the league is not clear on what it stands for. And right now a lot of people think it is not. Sophie Cunningham's popularity is telling you something. One of the most revealing parts of this whole moment is not even the backlash. It is the support. Because Sophie Cunningham is not getting all this attention just because she said something controversial. She is getting it because a lot of people feel like she said something plainly that too many institutions try to blur. That matters. Whether someone agrees with her or not, her popularity in this moment tells you there's a very large audience for directness, certainty, and perceived authenticity around this issue. That is a major signal. Especially in a league where people often speak carefully, cautiously, and in ways designed not to trigger internal fallout. Sophie did the opposite, and the result is that people feel like she means exactly what she says. That has real power, not just political power, brand power, audience power, attention power. And that is part of what makes this so uncomfortable for the WNBA. Because once a player's clarity starts generating a larger audience than the league's own messaging, the league has a new problem. It is no longer controlling the emotional center of the conversation. This keeps exposing the same league problem. Here's the simplest way to say it. The business side of the WNBA is moving faster than the cultural side. That is the root issue. The audience is growing faster than the league's internal emotional comfort with that audience. The spotlight is growing faster than the league's messaging discipline. The stakes are growing faster than the culture's ability to absorb disagreement without turning every conflict into a symbolic war. That is why these moments keep escalating, because they are not random. They are symptoms. Clark exposes the scale problem. Sophie exposes the speech problem. Stephen A exposes the mainstream perception problem. Same league, different pressure points, same underlying instability. The real takeaway. So, what actually happened here? Stephen A. Smith did not create this controversy. He exposed its scale. Sophie Cunningham did not create every tension inside the WNBA. She exposed how quickly one direct answer can split the room. Brittney Griner did not invent the broader fairness debate, but her name now carries symbolic weight inside it, whether the league likes that or not. And Caitlin Clark did not ask to become the center of every major WNBA firestorm. But her visibility has made that almost unavoidable. That is the real story. Not one quote, not one clip, not one player. A league being forced into a much bigger version of itself, while still struggling to decide what it wants to be. And now that this conversation has gone fully mainstream, there is no shrinking it back down.